my biggest aim isn't just to like have a thing that does well in this music NFT scene. For me, the goal is to take this thing outside of that bubble. And to do that, I need the people in this bubble to back it, right? Because that's what's worked for me in the past, right? Is that selling those editions on Sound and Catalog and Zora. I guess my collectors have always been like helping me fund my label in a way.
Yeah, I do not want my heart on my sleeve. I cannot let them see in too deep, cause I know they can use it against me. Only one I can trust is me. I got niggas I keep around me.
Episode 30 of Invest in Music with Sound of Fractures. Today we're here to talk about the Sound of Fractures token and his upcoming album called Scenes. We talk about his background as a producer in the UK, the impact that it's having on the electronic music scene as a whole, and much, much more. As a reminder, you can collect this episode on investinmusic.xyz. It's the best way to support our guests, so without further ado, let's get into it. Episode 30 of Invest in Music with Sound of Fractures. Welcome back to Invest in Music. Today we are here with a very special guest, Jamie, aka Sound of Fractures. How are we feeling today, man?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. I just want to caveat by saying that Jamie made time to come hop on this episode at the last minute. He's an artist I've been following for quite a long time, and he has quite a lot to share here. So, Jamie, why don't you take us all the way back to the beginning and tell us a little bit about Sound of Fractures and kind of how you started the project?
Right, well, I've been a producer for quite a long time. Sound of Fractures project was born out of, I guess, like me setting out on a kind of new stage of my career. Like I've been producing for other people for a very long time and producing in kind of commercial music industry in the UK since I was a teenager, really. And it was always on other people's terms. I did a lot of sessions where I made records with people where, everything I did was kind of just like a little bit too to the left. And, I kind of always pushed back against like really conforming or like polishing things. And I was very good at making like hot records or hot ideas, I should say. And kind of interesting records that kind of started off projects, but I wasn't, looking back now, I wasn't focused enough or suited maybe to like really focusing in on how to kind of fit things into the commercial industry. But I had like a good living of what I did. I just kind of reached a point where I really was getting tired of making 300 songs a year, and whether or not they were heard by anyone was really out of my hands. It was, so many moving pieces in the puzzle. And it's a great career for those who love it. My friends still do it. It's just, I had this moment where I just realized, maybe this isn't fulfilling me because I'm meant to be an artist, and I won't know until I go out there and really focus on my own music for a bit. So that's what I did. And Sound of Fractures was born at the same time as my first child. So it was this kind of moment of wanting to be present for like my kid, having had lots of friends in the music industry and actually friends whose parents were in the music industry who found it hard to be present. I kind of, those things came together, and Sound of Fractures, the first releases were very much like about friends and family and connections and kind of, while everyone else was heading into this kind of like, I guess like hyper-paced social media world, I really wanted to focus in on like the personal and the human contact and the human content of music and people and story, and that's how it was all started.
I feel like a lot of that comes through very well in your artist project. I mean, in this episode, we're going to talk about the token that you launched, the upcoming album that you have. But before we do that, you mentioned that you started the project right around when you had your first child, but you had been in music commercially for a long time before that. Can you go back to your earliest memories you have with music as a whole, and then how you got into the role of becoming a producer and someone that was making music for other people in the first place?
Oh man, like I grew up in one of those houses. It was really hard to pinpoint those moments, but my parents both worked in the music industry, but kind of had a rough ride of it, I guess. My mum actually quit when I was 2 years old, and it's something that definitely played a factor in my decision to take a shift, because she had this job that sounded amazing, right? And like to all my friends, they were like, "Is that what your mum did? And she quit to have you?" And when I spoke to my mum about it, it was just never a question, right? She was just like, "I wanted to be there, present for you," and it was always in the back of my mind, growing up. So in a way, like my first memories of music are like work. Music as work. Like my parents both worked. My dad was constantly in and out of work at different labels, as the industry is often like that. In like going long periods with my with my mum telling me never to work in music because it was too unreliable, right? As we struggled in these kind of like gaps in like self-employed work. And then beyond that, just it I guess music being everywhere in my house, right? Like walls of records. Our back room was just a wall of records, which later in life became like my library to sample from. But when I was younger, it was just I guess I didn't realize how much of a privilege it was. It wasn't like I got any industry advantages, but it was just like the language of the industry was kind of very natural to me, like how it worked. I was always around it in some way, in a way that I wasn't conscious of, but it definitely very much benefited me in terms of like how to navigate the industry, I guess, and just how to understand how it works. So I always played instruments, but I never really found my home. My parents got me to play the recorder, got me to play the violin, didn't work. Bass guitar, I was into rock bands. At one point I was playing a saxophone. And I remember being in a rock band with some of my friends and them just being like, you're really good at playing the bass, but you're not playing bass lines. You're like playing melodies. And it wasn't until I became like my late teens. My mate's brother actually was a drum and bass producer, and we used to sit in his room and play FIFA while he made beats. And just we kind of accumulated his old equipment, and it was kind of that realization that I was never meant to play one instrument. I'd always try to force myself to play one instrument, and suddenly I had all these tools where I could like take all these pieces of the world around me and put it together into records or into sound. And yeah, we started making beats, and that was kind of the beginning of my career, making hip hop beats. Coming out of an indie band and making hip hop beats, sampling soul records and playing guitars on it and stuff. And there wasn't loads of people doing that. And we were just, our friends run club nights, we were working with rappers, and we were cutting vinyl and making tapes and doing all that stuff, and just living, part-time making music. And the music we were making started to catch heat, and that pulled us into the pop music industry, as it often does, right? The UK just didn't really have black music in like the mainstream. We had like R&B pop here and there, and I was kind of working at the beginning of the first few crossover rappers, but that was the only way to earn a living making beats, right? Was to like go into that world, and I got pulled into that world, which was really exciting, but also, in the long run, quite frustrating.
And what did getting pulled into that world look like for you? So explain to me kind of how old you were at this time, what you were doing professionally, academically. I know that, university plays a big role in your life now as a lecturer. Kind of what did this look like as a whole? Were you going to school studying music? Were you just doing it full time,
I
or what did the pieces look like?
I came out of like what is like sixth form, which is like high school for us, into university, and did like a sound engineering course because my parents were like, you need to go to university. So I was like, okay. So I found something that was related to music and jumped in. But to be honest, I was never really there because we were making records. I was out in the studio all day and all night, and I was at friends' houses making records. And I had friends who were really making really successful club nights, and we were going to the nights and meeting people to work with, and just like living as part of like a music scene, I guess, and just making music. And off the back of that, we got pulled into some meetings with some A&Rs who had heard the records we had made. We have like, in the UK, we have kind of, I guess like maybe sometimes like a clearer route to like becoming a professional because it's smaller. So you have these kind of smaller stations that the bigger stations pick up of. And we had some records that got picked up and got played in spot plays and some big shows. And as naturally what happened, we started to get calls to go and do sessions. And I was actually really lucky to work with some A&Rs who understood, even though they were making some terrible music, they understood hip hop, and had actually signed some really cool early hip hop records and put me and my friend, we were a production team, my friend Adam, who now runs various different labels and stuff that he's doing, into sessions with pop bands. But we were lucky enough that he put us in with really great writers who understood beat makers and like helped us turn loops into songs. And it was like a really exciting time. It was like the end of big money, right? Like we were in these huge studios as like 21-year-olds smoking way too much weed in the studio when we shouldn't have been. And just not thinking about anything like you do at that age, right? Like I signed my first publishing deal at like 22, and we never got like a massive single, but for the UK at that time, we were getting really good production fees. We were working with lots of people. We were doing writing trips in the States, and you don't really think about how it's coming back to you financially when you're in that like early, I don't know, like boost, that potential of being young, right? You're doing deals off potential. You're making like cool records and people are like, this is really cool. It's not a hit, but imagine how good they'll be when they make a hit. And we kind of rode that for a long time. You can ride that from a long time, doing it, waiting for that big record, but you can wait forever. Some people do.
And I mean, it was a very special time too, because I feel like being in the UK making this music, what was your proxy to the US music? And help me better understand, like, what was the difference between what was happening in the UK at that time and what was happening in the US? Because I have a follow-up question here, but I just want to better understand when you were going into these
It was
sessions and
miles
making
away.
pop records. Yeah, how would you distinguish
It
the
was
two?
it was very different. I mean, the pop music industry is definitely similar, right? Like the LA writing scene and the UK writing scene, Europe, Germany, and Sweden and places, it's all quite similar, right? Because a lot of the same writers. It's you going in with a pop singer and a top line writer who's like a more experienced writer as a beat maker, and that's kind of generally how it works. Like, and it was kind of like that back then. The big differences were is there wasn't like mainstream black music culture in the UK like there was. Just the history of black music in the UK and the US is really different. I mean, we got fed everything, but essentially we had rap music and we had some amazing electronic music, and things like that happening, which eventually turned into like garage and grime music. But they were very like underground culture, right? Like the government always tried to suppress them, and they were always, as you would expect, like pushed into a corner. So we didn't really have any like mainstream radio outlets, right? There was like a rap show on Friday, on Radio 1, which is like the big national station, and there was underground radio, and that was kind of it, right? Like it was very hard to make a living, but it was a really exciting time, man. Like now everything's available. Makes me feel old, right? But I remember just like waiting for that one radio show a week where we could hear like the newest American music, right? Like the newest stuff from New York or LA or whatever it was. And you just had to wait to hear it, and you had to record it, and that was the only way to hear it. So it was really different in that respect. But the UK is totally different now. Like the last 15 years has just completely shifted in terms of mainstream music. As it's followed the money. It's not necessarily like a cultural shift or like a national shift, but there is an industry here based around like essentially like black music of different types, right? And when I was coming up, there really wasn't. There was music, there's loads of music and scenes, but there wasn't like enough money to make like a decent living from it, I guess.
Right. And I think even now what I've noticed is that UKG, like this house wave that's happening right now, is so heavily influenced by UK producers. I mean, even if you listen to the last Skrillex album, there's so much influence being taken from
Yeah.
UK artists. And I've just noticed that there's such like a renaissance of music that's happening specifically in electronic music around like the UK influenced sounds. But I guess I'm curious to hear for you, like when did you notice that these sounds coming out of the UK were sort of crossing over into more mainstream culture at large?
We've always been good at doing like our own thing. We had even back then, like when I was coming up, we didn't have like mainstream like hits that were like rap artists, but we had this kind of like left of center scenes in like Bristol doing like trip hop, like artists like Tricky and Massive Attack, and these artists that were taking like American hip hop and like mixing it with, I guess, like British dance music, like influences of jungle and garage, and that stuff was kind of bubbling along in the background all the time. And some of that became really successful, right? Like we still hear that now in like FK Twigs or James Blake, or even just like in Frank Ocean records and stuff. That there's that approach that kind of the UK was always doing in the background that has always been there, but we're definitely seeing. Yeah, I know what you mean. Like I think artists like Skrillex and Fred again have really pulled back that culture to the forefront, along with nostalgia, right? Like it comes in cycles. All of a sudden, all the UK rap hits are all like sampling old R&B or garage songs. And I guess it's that generational thing of it coming back round again. The first rap records that were like in the charts here were in my generation were like garage records, right? So Solid Crew. It was like our own thing, which is like we're lucky to have that. We're lucky to have those moments where there was a thing that felt like ours.
100%. And I feel like there's so much excitement right now around producers going out to London to just tap into that collective energy. I have so many friends in LA who have been just spending a week, 2 weeks in the UK trying to set up as many sessions with producers as possible because there's clearly something very special happening there right now. And I think it's really important for you to highlight that that culture has been growing and been a thing for many, many generations prior to this. But at least from my personal music discovery experience, I'm finding myself putting a lot more energy and time into better understanding the lay of the land of the UK, better understanding the sounds and the artists that are coming up there. So I just find it very fascinating to hear that that's a culture that you've been immersed in for quite some time now.
I feel like we have just like a great way. I mean, I see it as cool music, but we have, I think within Europe as well, but we have a kind of a way of making imperfect music feel hot and exciting. And I think that's kind of always been embedded in early jungle and garage and some of the rap music that came out of the UK, but also especially like electronic music like Burial, Massive Attack, and those things that kind of blended different genres. I think that the big American pop music, but also like the LA writing scene, just became very much about polished music off the back of that kind of Max Martin, like I'm trying to think of names now, but there was like like I guess like Future Bass maybe, like off the back of that like dubstep, but kind of like what became like bro step, and it was all about like a lot of new synths that people were using, really defining the sound of the music, and it got more and more polished and more perfect in a way. And I feel like we're like heading back into like craving emotion, and I think that's why a lot of that dance music is really coming back to the forefront, and people like Fortet have become like like important again because it's been about like emotional connection and not just about the drop, although we still love the drop, right? Like especially TikTok. But I think that Fred again has definitely been one of the artists who have really brought that back, and maybe someone like Skrillex has done the job of kind of towing that line really well, of still bringing in that kind of clinical high energy music but mixing it with some of that like raw edge. Even like the Weekend EP that happened a while back that had like the Skrillex beat on it, that was really like UK sounding to me.
Yep.
Like it definitely had a lot of those like influences in there.
100%. And I feel like it's a really good segue back into your artist project because when I first started listening to your music on catalog, it immediately stood out to me because it was less of like a 2 minute pop record and more of like a 5 minute ballad. And I feel like you had this really articulate way of just like creating a world and a sound and an emotion around it. And I mean, it makes so much sense to hear that you came from a commercial background to be able to take, years of producing pop records to then creating this foundation for yourself as an artist where you're able to really expand on those ideas and create these beautiful, scenes that you're basically putting together in the form of your music. And so I guess to turn that into a question, I'd love to hear about when you started the Sound of Fractures project, what was your intention with the music that you were making?
The intention was really just about emotional honesty, I guess, and I really sort of had this idea in my head of what was it about all this music that really connected with me, and I think it was this idea of beauty in the imperfection, of kind of something that kind of has become part of like the identity of my project is about, and I guess it's part of sample culture as well, is like taking all these broken elements that maybe shouldn't fit together and putting them together in new ways to make something that's different and beautiful in a way that maybe you wouldn't have expected, and like a broken mirror, or it's that kind of idea has always been in my head. I love a lot of indie cinema and movies, and I love kind of like unpolished, slightly odd things. I think especially as music has become so easy to make, that like finding a sound is really hard to do. And when I started Sound of Fractures, I remember making those demos and being really tempted to try and mix them. And I didn't, I just mastered them. I didn't like go too deep on them because I didn't want them to like lose the soul. I didn't want them to become, I kind of wanted them to sound different, right? We've got so much music. There's so much good music. There's so many amazing producers. Like I run a playlist, and the music I get sent is amazing. It's all amazing. It's all really good. Like you could tell me any of those records were made by a Fred again or something, and I would believe you. But I think it's become harder and harder to stand out, and I think that is something that I want to go. I'm really trying to go back to on my next record as well. Is not trying to be perfect, and just really focusing on, yeah, just on what makes my process my process. Coming from a background of making hip hop for years, using an MPC, being like obsessed with that kind of like underground Bristol dance music like Burial and all the drum and bass producers that came out of there, who built their sound using breaks, and kind of going back to that. A lot of my I try to make sure all of my Sound of Fractures stuff is all drum samples from when I made hip hop beats. Most of them are like Jay Dilla style samples, right? Like I try really hard to steer away from splice in places, even when it's uncomfortable sometimes, because I want to make sure it feels like me. And it's a slower road, I think, because it doesn't always fit into like easy playlist boxes, but I'm in this kind of for the long haul, and I'm trying to build something that is still, I want Sound of Fractures to still be like a musical entity and a part of my life in 10 years time. And that's kind of always been the plan, is to like build slowly but steadily.
Totally. And I feel like one thing that stands out to me about your project is you're so experimental in the way that you approach not only your music, but also sort of everything around the music itself. And I guess kind of transitioning that into a different topic, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about, Sound of Fractures to me has kind of been this artist project that creates amazing music. It's something that I've always, every single record you put on chain, I've had such a pleasure listening to. But I feel like you've quickly developed a brand for yourself as someone that's been willing to take a lot of risk and kind of run these new age experiments to kind of bring a new light to kind of not only yourself, but kind of the space as a whole. And I'd love to hear more about sort of where that stemmed from, and then maybe more directly kind of what your relationship was with this whole on-chain music world that allowed you to start to have these experiments in the first place.
I guess I started with this really simple premise, which was that someone presented this thing to me that I could put multiple forms of media in, and I was really obsessed with visuals and like visual collaborations, and I found it frustrating that my YouTube video that I thought was beautiful, that a friend had made, was getting very few views, and it was very disparate to the music. And my first thought was just, someone presented these things to me that I could sell this item together as like one piece of art. And that was really exciting to me. When I first did my first drop, it was like at a time where Sound was doing like 0.1 25 editions, and no one was really doing visual stuff in the same way. I did 3 visualizers that were made by an artist friend of mine, Jackson Ducasse, and I did 3 editions of each one and just minted them. I think I just did it on OpenSea for like 0.05, which at the time was like cheap, but also like really cheap for a full length visual. And there was only 3 of them, and I just had lots of conversations with people that I really inspired me, and they just seemed to be the people that collected them. And it was that really got me started. And I think what excited me was that every time I did a release, I could find a way to distribute the music that I could tie into the concept of the release. And I think that's still what's the most exciting thing for me about the blockchain. And I love places like Sound, and I've actually been able to do that within the remit of platforms that have like a drop model. But I think the thing that I try really hard to stick to, because it was my original thing that excited me, was that it allowed to kind of plant your identity in the way that you distribute the music, as well as the way, it's not just about selling, it's about like, the story can be a part of how you, the story can be a part of how you sell the music too, and how the consumer buys it, right? Like I did drops on Sound where people submitted photos to be a part of the artwork based on the concept of the song, and other things like that. And it just allowed me to think about what is this song about and how is the release mechanism, how can that relate to what the song is about. And it just added like another dimension to what like we keep calling world building now, which is really, I guess, like trying to just implant our identity in everything we do. And being able to do that into the product was really amazing, because what do we do before? We just put it on Spotify, we pitch to a playlist, we do Submit Hub, and then we just go again, right? Like content out now, next song. And it just felt, when you've done it a lot, you get really slick at that stuff and it feels really repetitive. And it just felt so refreshing to be like out of that routine and into this new world. And I guess the other big part of that is to have people connecting with your music who are like hitting you up, who have bought your music, being like, I love this song because of this, which we don't get on a lot of those sort of traditional Web2 platforms either. So, it felt like a new scene, right? I mean, you were there, and still are, we are. It feels like a scene and a culture, and it's very hard to be a part of something like that from the beginning, right? Like all the music we love came from scenes, and you kind of had to be at a place in a time to be there, and it was really exciting, and still is, to feel like we're in something from the beginning and a part of its development. And I think all of those things combined have just made the last year, it's changed my experience of music completely. And I don't make a financial argument for that. It's an experience argument. It's a process argument about what being a musician is. And I kind of really do believe that we are kind of rethinking and kind of on the forefront of developing or experimenting with what a musician or a creator might be in 5-10 years time.
Right. And there's lots to unpack there. I would say the first thing that resonates with me is the idea of world building and how this space allows you to create a more succinct ecosystem and environment for your music to exist in. I think that's something that I really want to highlight, is that when I think of on-chain music, I don't think just about, what is this song available for on sound? I think about the visual elements of it. If there's drops on other platforms, if there's collector chats, if there's a website, like there's so many pieces to tie together that I feel like really create this holistic experience around your music. And I think the point about the scene is extremely accurate too. It's one thing that I've struggled a lot with, is that I personally feel such a strong affinity to this new scene and this new culture. But from the outside, I think that it can get lost in translation, because I think a lot of people just look to the space as a new way to form capital. And I don't think that they see that although there may be clear channels to monetize your music, that doesn't mean that's the only reason that people are here. And one thing that I've been trying to spend a lot more time on is figuring out, how do we translate, what this scene is and what the values are around the experiences and the culture of the music, more so than the financial opportunities that present themselves.
Right. It's a challenge that we're all going through. We're constantly reconciling. I mean, we're creators, right? We want to live off our music, and you can't help but be pulled towards this like bright star of your dream. It's just natural. So I think it's a tension that we're all kind of challenged with. I think we're challenged with in normal music, but I think it's healthier in some ways in a place, especially now. I think it's probably healthier outside of the bull run, because we're focusing in on the tools again, and strengthening the connections rather than these kind of like viral, I guess they're an equivalent of viral moments maybe, that aren't always replicable. There are things fall into place and they happen, but we're back in this place where we're like building block by block. And I think it's still a really exciting time. I think this year's been very exciting for me. It's been hard. It's always hard, but it's hard raising money in any area of creative
It's
industries,
definitely been
right?
hard.
So
Yeah.
it's very
And I
hard.
feel like you've definitely taken that approach head on. And one thing that I want to commend you on is, despite the fact that it has been hard, that hasn't been for a lack of effort. And I think that you, more than most artists, have really just put a flag in the sand of saying, I'm going to try a lot of different things to try and find the thing that really clicks and that really resonates with my collectors and with my audience. And so zooming in for a minute there, I want to talk about your next album, Scenes, because you mentioned world building. And I think that there's so much that connects to the audiovisual elements of that. But before we go to Scenes, I know that you recently put out this token, the Sound of Fractures token. This was a really big deal for you and something that I know you put a lot of time and energy into. I'd love for you to maybe give a quick background on the Sound of Fractures token, and then how it ties into projects like Scenes.
the idea was born out of wanting was actually like looking at what was happening around me and thinking about like what is a step up for an artist who's experimenting with these things, and also like what makes these tools different. And I think for me it was still this idea of like building your own things and doing things in a way that was like unique to your approach. And I really felt like to do that I wanted to make something that stood up on its own. And visually that's really important to me. It's like the visual side of things. And I loved things like Bjork had a Biophilia album that had a crazy like website, and In Rainbows by Radiohead was brilliant as well. And they weren't reliant on technology to do anything. They were like experiences that, you know, that just stuck with me. And it's always something that I've wanted to attempt. And I think I saw other artists doing things that were custom and interesting, and I really felt like my play, and always has been, was to do things that look and feel like me. And when everyone was doing like 3D images and doing a lot of the things that are kind of current, I kind of wanted to go against that and do things that were very like human and down to earth. And I couldn't really find the tools to do the things I wanted. I started to develop an idea for a project in my mind, and I just knew that I would have to find a way to build it myself, to be what it wanted to be, because it didn't really go in line with the incentives of a lot of platforms. And that's not to say anything bad about platforms. It was just that they have a goal and they have like a metric and they have like a path. And I felt like the idea that I wanted to build, which ended up being scenes, just didn't fit neatly into those boxes. It was kind of like a cross section of those things, but importantly also into like Web2 and normal music fans. And a lot of people were just focusing on chain and focusing on collectibles and focusing on that culture. And I wanted to try and do something that bridged that gap in a way that didn't really fit in a box. So the Sound of Fractures token developed, like a lot of my projects, it developed with my collectors, right? Having discussions like, how could I do this? I was in Black Dave's token chat a lot, and it was a model that was working. I talked with some of my collectors and they were like, look, it's a model that works. We understand this model. Let's experiment with this model. Like, you know, we'll back you if you want to give this a go. So I spent some time developing the language, and launched the token. And even from its like first day it's developed, right? It started as purely as like a patronage and altruistic model of just, you know, I'm going to build projects. Somebody needs to build these new projects that don't fit in a box, right? Because I believe this is the future and this is the real exciting use of this technology. But we can't build them just on like platforms terms. We need to build them in the grey gaps, in the spaces, right? Because the nature of technology is that we head down lanes that work. And I think to be really creative, you need to sit in those gaps and kind of cross over these different things that different people are doing. And it just wasn't possible to do it in a traditional platform. There wasn't the tooling there, or there wasn't the kind of infrastructure to really customize it in a way that made it about the artist, which is understandable. So we started it, and we, you know, through conversations it's adapted and slowly moved towards this model where we're at now, which is where in the end there's going to be a revenue share. So when the projects recoup on a project by project basis, every project is going to be pretty participatory in terms of like the audience and me, because I think that's like a future of music, or music of artist relationships and the audience relationship. And in return for participation, people are going to get a share of the revenue after we've recouped what we're spending on making the project work. And it feels like it's come like a really beautiful full circle, because the whole project, the first project, is about doing things with the audience and creating work with the audience that has emotional value. So to really like to finish it up in this really beautiful way, and in a way that only blockchain tools can do, is that if you buy tokens, when that revenue comes in, we'll reach that certain point and automatically it will get split between the token holders, to pay them back for the work that they're doing to contribute to the project. You know, essentially everyone is working together. So, you know, it's been hard to develop a model that again, the token doesn't quite fit into neat boxes, right? It's not quite patronage, it's not quite like meeting like the expectations of speculative people. But yeah, I kind of someone said an analogy to me recently that I think works really well, is that we're kind of like sending out boats into the unknown, and we don't know what we're going to find on that exploration, or what it's going to be worth when we bring it back. And we need people to be doing that. We can't just keep going down these paths that are comfortable. We have to kind of go out on these journeys into the unknown to see what we can bring back. And I think that artists are the only ones that can do that. And that's not because about them being better. It's just the freedom that you have as an independent artist allows you to experiment in ways that other entities can't. That's just, the nature of it. But we can't do it without money. So, I'm experienced enough to know that to make this work, we need a solid marketing budget, we need a solid ad spend, the story needs to be tight, the narrative needs to be tight, the rollout plan needs to be tight. So we're trying to do it all. And when I say we, I mean token holders too, right? Like, I'm running through these plays and ideas with people who have collected the token, and yeah, we're all incentivized to make this thing work, and it's exciting. It's hard to raise the money, but it's been really exciting. And every week someone new comes on board, and it feels amazing when they do.
Right. And I feel like that incentive alignment between your collectors is so powerful. A couple weeks ago we had on Abram from 0x Splits, and I was trying to really highlight the importance of on-chain earnings, specifically as it relates to music, because as your point there, being able to build a system where you're able to share proceeds with your fans in a very automated fashion would be very difficult to do in the traditional world, but here it actually becomes digestible. And I think there's still obviously a lot of challenges around, like, how do you get people to buy the token in the first place? How do you make sure that people understand it? But, I do just want to give you a lot of credit for really just going out there and saying, like, we're going to figure this out one way or another. And I think one thing that I really respect about how the token has evolved is now there is a very clear reason for, me as a buyer to want to participate in this ecosystem outside of just, the patronage model that you mentioned before, because there is a relationship between the proceeds that this album generates and the upside that token holders get to receive in return. And I think that one thing that I really just want to call out there is there's been a long history of social tokens within crypto. We've seen a couple different versions of this. We now see things like friend tech, et cetera. And I think one thing that I've always been, frustrated by is that these social tokens don't really have a very direct relationship with the creator, because it's basically just a way to bet on their brand. But there's no actual relationship to their earning potential, whether it be, on-chain or off-chain. And so I think for you to be able to say, hey, this is my artist token, and this artist token is actually going to represent a percentage of the proceeds that we make for my next album, those conversations are actually extremely important to have. And I think a lot of times people shy away from having those conversations because they're worried about, any of the ramifications around it. But again, I just want to say, I really respect that you're just going for it and doing it, because I think we need to have a lot more of those experiments happen, a lot more of artists going out on those boats and bringing things back. And I think that this is going to be looked back on as one of the earliest experiments and what ends up becoming a very tried and true model for artists in the future.
It's always evolving, right? Like, I mean, the way that we've set up the token is on a project by project basis. And I had a few people talk to me about this, but I think that the collectors want to feel they're contributing a lot to like our careers, right? Like I've funded EPs off the earnings that I've made, right, from in this on chain, and over the last couple of years it's been central to the growth of my project. But after you've collected for a long time, having like a big collection, it doesn't always really communicate like the value add that you're bringing. And I don't think it should always be about acknowledging that in kind of like a worshipping a collector way. But I think that it's credit where credit's due, right? These things are like ongoing conversations and relationships, and the token allows, especially on a project by project basis, something that the blockchain can do that other things can't, right? Apart from the remuneration, there is immutable evidence of contribution, which is a moment in time and a thing that happened. And in the same way that there's plaques in galleries for like donators, or a name on a hospital wing, there are going to be things that come out of this time that are remembered for being the thing that changed things or influenced other things. And the blockchain allows people to say, I helped make that happen. Like, there's my name written down as part of this moment, changing things for music artists. And it allows people to go out and talk about the project and say, like, I'm helping make this thing happen. Check it out. It's really interesting. We're doing something different. You should check this
Right.
out. I think this is the future, or this could be a example of the type of things that happen in the future. And I think that's powerful as well. It's different to just collecting and collecting and collecting and collecting. And I think it's taken collectors a minute to get round that, right? Like some collectors I had,
Hmm.
were like, oh, I just didn't, I wanted to buy your songs, but I didn't really get why to buy the token. But now they're in it and they're a part of the process and they feel like a part of this thing and they're getting glimpses of the project and I'm sounding ideas off them and bouncing things and they're seeing that develop in response to the conversations. It's an experience. It's not just a purchase, right? It's like I can't, it's not always intentional. People, everyone's getting pulled into the process, and I think that's inherently very different, right? That is not something we can do easily without the blockchain.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting perspective because I feel like in a lot of ways the value prop of collecting music is that you're supposed to be involved in the process, but the reality is just calling how it is. I think that for a lot of artists, it's a lot to manage putting out your songs on Spotify, Apple Music, putting out videos on TikTok, putting music out on Sound, and then having to maintain relationships across all those different platforms. Then on top of that, have to be able to maintain an even deeper relationship with collectors in this brand new world who are largely crypto native and maybe have different incentives from some of your fans on other platforms. And so to your point about like collecting, it's been something I've been thinking about quite a lot because I'm a big fan of every artist making sure when you release a song on Spotify, putting up a representation of that on chain. But I think one of the challenges with that is as you put up more music on chain, the question about why I should collect that music becomes a little bit more difficult to answer because as a holder of these songs, you kind of wonder, are the earliest songs going to be the most valuable? Is this next song going to be the most valuable? Are all these songs going to be valuable? Are only some of them going to be valuable? Do these songs need to be valuable for me to collect it? And I feel like we're very much in this limbo state right now where there's clearly a demographic of people who are very passionate about supporting artists on chain and collecting music, but I don't think we've quite found the form function into how that support materializes as something that's either very meaningful to them as a patron, or on the flip side of that, as something that's going to actually return them an investment, which kind of makes it worth their time from a financial perspective. And I'm curious to hear how you think about, the expectations that collectors have today and how as an artist you want to provide to them to make it feel like they are sought after and taken care of while you're also trying to juggling a million other things being an artist yourself.
I think there's definitely something to be said for a sense of belonging. I think it's maybe understated as a value in music, right? Or like like a moment in time or a representation of a moment in time. I think we 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 overlook. I think maybe we'll look back at that more often, right? Like I think when I think about the Sound of Fractures collector group, Real Friends, it definitely represents like a big moment in my life, and I think it has been a conduit for a lot of people for that. And maybe they won't remember the individual songs, or maybe they'll remember different songs for different reasons. But I've been thinking a lot more about the experience around it. I think the token really changes things, right? Because, and hopefully Scenes, the next project, will as well, where the idea is they go on for longer. And that kind of came from a few of my collectors, CY, Fedi, and Martin. I should shout them out. Talking about repetition and like longevity and kind of like journeys and the kind of those conversations around how songs link together. And I think the artist journey can link them together, like the growth of the artist, them reaching new heights and growing. But if that isn't feeling like clear, I think it becomes a bit like disconnected. And the token's been really interesting to me is because like we're all working on this one thing. And instead of kind of having these big drops where I'm like, gotta make this drop work, gotta make this drop work, gotta be in spaces, gotta be in chat groups, gotta talk about the drop. It's almost like I'm just like dropping breadcrumbs along the way. And if people collect them, they collect them. And if they don't, they don't. Because in the middle is this like this unifying kind of journey that we're all on to make this thing happen. This
Right.
one kind of focused thing happen. And I've been doing like little things on Zora Chain and more like bits of process, like things about how the planning has been going, a song, a demo, it's felt exciting again because yet again I'm just, I love just not doing the same thing over and over again. It's just a different feeling. It's a different pressure as well because, like I've got really ambitious goals for this album and I've got a target in my mind, which is like a minimum you need to make that impact and get it to new people because I'm ambitious and my biggest aim isn't just to like have a thing that does well in this music NFT scene. For me, the goal is to take this thing outside of that bubble. And to do that, I need the people in this bubble to back it, right? Because that's what's worked for me
Yep.
in the past, right? Is that selling those editions on Sound and Catalog and Zora has given me the tool to hire someone to do PR or do Facebook ads. And that has been this like, they're all, I guess my collectors have always been like helping me fund my label in a way. And I think this maybe is just like a better vehicle for that, for them as well as me, right? Like this is much more like, oh, they're not, those stories aren't disparate, they're on chain now, right? Before it was like all these separate things and I was gathering them all up and putting them into these projects and executing and going again. Well, now the token can like more clearly represent that journey on chain, which matters to me. Like I think it still matters that we have this thing of like recording information, and like whether or not we can read that information perfectly yet or in cool ways, we know that's challenging. But I think for the people that care about collecting on chain, it's a different feeling. But like I have to help grow that feeling. Like the journey has to like I have to plant a seed, right? The first token is like a seed. And hopefully as we go on, people will continue to invest in the token because it brings value into the experience of their lives, right? Being inside a music project instead of just being delivered the final product. And I think it's hard for creators because we're used to keeping our ideas close to our chest, and I battle with that as well. But it's arguably the thing that I think probably even major artists will be exploring. Maybe, whether it's not on chain, I don't know, but we have to change this thing, which is like the gap between the artist and the audience. And it went from an idea that people like us talked about 6 months ago to being mainstream. Like all of a sudden
Yep.
everyone's on TikTok. Like we need to participate with our audience. Like it's like some new thing that we haven't been doing for ages. But I guess that's a positive sign, right? Like things have shifted, social media is getting exhausting, and we're all looking for new ways to get more value from this thing,
That's right.
music.
And I would say, with relation to your point about breadcrumbs, it's definitely been noticeable as someone who's collecting in the space. I mean, you just put out a new artist project called No Moons with one of your friends. I know that you've been teasing the Scenes album that's coming out for people to get involved. And, just the way that you've articulated the collective sum of the whole, there is no doubt in my mind that you are thinking about this every single day and that you're thinking about it in terms of a wider picture. So I guess in a way to kind of closing thoughts for this episode, like what should people know about the next chapter ahead? And if they are listening to this episode and they would like to get more involved, what's the best place for them to do so?
Well, I guess the easiest way is socials, right? Like SO Fractures, which is short for Sound of Fractures, on all my socials. Is the best place to reach me. There's different types of content in different places, but I guess the bulk of the information is on Twitter and on my Mirror page where I kind of share my process. And the future for me is about rethinking how people see a music career, and coming on board to be a part of that experimentation. I don't like to present answers, but I've got some great ideas. That I like to develop with the people around me, and I know that music has this incredible emotional value that attaches itself to the things in our lives in a way that nothing else can, because it soundtracks everything, right? Like in a way that other things can't. In its very nature that it is audio, it attaches itself to these like things in our life. And we just haven't found the best way of capturing that again in this kind of like new modern world. And the project that I want to do next is about that. It's about capturing moments in people's lives and attaching music to it and giving people a memento of that to take home and own. And that is different, and that is something that blockchain can help us with. And yeah, it's going to be exciting to see if it grows, because it grows in stages, and the whole point is it gives it time to have like a potential virality in the way that it works. And the fact that it's about emotional connection has made it, you know, challenging to communicate, because people, you know, people are like, what about the money? But where's the money? Where's the money coming? And the point that, you know, I keep having to tell people is there is only money in music because of emotional connection, right? But it's going on tickets, it's going on merch, it's going on other places. It's just because streaming doesn't capture it. There's plenty of money. It's just that we represent that emotional value in other ways, right? Like, I'm happy to buy that £60 t-shirt to wear it out because that album meant so much to me. But people just haven't made that connection with buying a song yet. So it's an experiment in how like an artist like me can be more in control of that emotional connection. Can we like foster that emotional connection with the music and make something that we both value? You get something you value, I get something I value, and we go create it and make it, and we go through that process together. And yeah, if you want to learn more and want to be a part of it, then yeah, follow me on socials and get involved. Help me make this thing happen, because we can't make things happen on our own. It's just not possible. And if we rely on larger stereotypical funding pools, then they're always going to get dragged towards, you know, different incentives. And we need both things. We need both things. It's not about one, but we also need flexible, agile creators to have income to make things that don't fit in boxes, because that's how we create stuff that we didn't know we wanted until we made it.
Plus
That's
one.
my
And I would
pitch.
just say that I know I've been, yeah, it's an amazing one, man. And I would say that for me, being able to just have these conversations in such an in-depth level, you know, me and you on Telegram, we go back and forth quite a bit about what's the right way to do an artist token, what's the right way to launch a project, etc. And I'll just say that I've been very critical, you know, in some of my responses to you, but you've always kind of taken those in stride and been very receptive to hearing them out, but still maintaining your own like sense of innovation and sort of progress with everything. So I'm really glad we were able to have you on this episode just to kind of share your journey, because I think people are going to look back on it and just be so moved by how forward you were in a lot of these things that you are doing. And I would just say that, you know, for anyone listening to this, if you really want to see the inside roots and experiments that are happening here with on-chain music, I really don't think there's a much better place than getting involved with your whole ecosystem, picking up some of those artist tokens, learning more about the album, and, you know, just kind of doing everything that we talked about here. So with that in mind, thank you so much for coming on. I know it was definitely a last minute ask, but I really am thankful that we got the opportunity to sit down and talk and share more of your story.
Thanks for having me, man. Yeah, it's 1:30 a.m. here, so if I'm looking and sounding tired, it's because it's a late one. But sometimes this is when you have the best conversations. So yeah, thanks so much, man.
That's right. The grind never stops. Thank you again for coming on, Jamie, aka Sound of Fractures, and we will see you guys again next week.
Safe coup.